The collector is down low and the tanks are way up above that double window there, so that I use water antifreeze mixture, and the hot fluid rises, there's a heat exchanger so I can take a shower in regular water, and it comes down, it pumps itself. And this is nice to do. The main solar primer we have has plans for a more normal system where you have the collectors on the roof and the tank in the basement. Then you have to use a pump to move the fluid. We usually use a 12-volt DC pump driven by a little solar panel, and makes the control easier because when the sun shines, the pump runs. So anyway, that's some of the details of the house. You have a barrier built into every solar cell. It's called a PN junction in the silicon cell. The cuprous oxide one was called a Schottky barrier junction. I won't go into all the details of this unless somebody asks me. But basically, you have the top of the cell becomes negatively charged because that's where all the electrons pile up. And the back of the cell becomes positively charged because that's where the holes are. Holes are places where electrons used to be but aren't anymore because they got knocked loose. And they move around too. And so you take the electrons out of the cell, they are repelling each other, so you get a potential difference. That means you have the ability to do work. Take the electrons, go out the wire, you make them do some work, charge a battery, run a motor or light or something, and you put them back in the back. The back of the cell is covered with aluminum, which injects the electrons back into the silicon. The electrons fall back into the hole. This is the secret of photovoltaic cells. The only thing that moves are electrons, and you put them all back where you got them from. Nothing is used up because you put them all back, and nothing wears out. I have measured 100-year-old solar cells that were the same as the day they were made. And so you have something that it lasts almost indefinitely. The 31-year-old panel here, actually all those cells are still in perfectly good shape. Some people say, oh, the panels last 25 years. They come with a 25-year guarantee. That doesn't mean that when the 25th year comes, they suddenly die. That's what your washing machine's supposed to do. No, these keep going. And you'll be able to give them to your grandchildren, and they can give them to their grandchildren and so forth. So anyway, if you put twice as much light on a cell, you get twice as much electricity out of it, but the cell overheats. And when it overheats, the output voltage drops because you have this barrier, and the electrons, if they're energetic, can jump the barrier backwards, and that will give you a lower voltage because they fall back into the hole without doing the work. So here's the arithmetic. Those solar cells, the typical solar cell you can buy in a module nowadays is about 15% efficient. The new sun power ones are around 20%. They've hit 22% in the laboratory, but they're 19 or 20% in the typical production line cells. But usual ones are 15%. 10% of the light bounces off the cell and isn't used. That means 75% of the light goes into the cell and ends up as heat, because 15% comes out as electricity. That's why they overheat. So what we're doing is we're able to use reflectors to put more light on the cell because we have an aluminum fin with a copper tube in the back, and we run a cooling fluid through it, so we have water-cooled solar cells. Now, what's cool for a solar cell is really pretty warm. The design temperature of that is 60 degrees Celsius, which is 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's way above where you normally have your electric water heater set. So that means that I have, the system in Nicaragua. You crack open the hot water and you mix lots of cold with it in order to make it the temperature you want. And which also means that the only time I didn't have to do that was when I had a whole batch of people staying and I was making pancakes for them and I was person number 6 to take the shower. And it was still warm enough, but I didn't have to mix any cold. So that's the idea. Now here's a picture showing the pipes. This is where we're building it. We haven't put it in its case yet. And each fin has a copper tube in the back to carry the water. In the case in Maine, of course, we use a water antifreeze mixture. I recommend using propylene glycol, which is what they use in the hydronic systems in Maine. It's considered safe, edible antifreeze. I hope it is because they use it in McDonald's shakes to make them smooth. And this is the Evergreen solar cells I now use. They are made by a ribbon growing process. You pull a ribbon of silicon right out of a vat of molten silicon with a pair of quartz fibers to define the edges. And it's a very inexpensive way of doing it. Those cells are only 120 microns thick. 25.4 microns is a thousandth of an inch. So they're about 4.5 thousandths of an inch thick. They're like 4.5 mil. It's very thin. So they use only 1/4 the amount of silicon that the single crystal cells use. And for a while, silicon, pure silicon was in short supply because the manufacturers were having trouble making it as fast enough to meet the demand. Now, silicon comes from sand, silicon dioxide. You have the sand hills here. You have enough silicon to supply the entire world with photovoltaic cells many times over. So there's no shortage in the raw material. It's just a matter of the processing to get the purity you need. Yes?
Isn't that the most abundant mineral in the world?
Oh, it is. It is. In fact, astrophysicists, when they're talking about planets, they refer to planets like ours as silicon planets because it is the most abundant mineral in the crust of a small rocky planet. So we don't have to worry about running out. There are other things you can make cells out of. So anyway, this is the hybrid concept. Now here's another type of hybrid. We're putting up a wind generator. That's my favorite Iwo Jima wind generator raising photograph.